how does your company work with hardware organizations? Do you produce open source hardware? Do you produce software that works with open source hardware? Do you work with open source hardware companies in partnerships and do open patents? Does that matter? Like, for example, Tesla opened all their patents, right? But if you don't have the equipment to build that stuff, does anyone care? Should we?
I can go ahead and start that. So I am one of the startup folks on the panel here. So I'm director of community at a company called Fictiv. And so Fictiv does is we're a manufacturing platform for engineers and designers who are building those physical products, whether open or closed. We give them access to the best machinists in the country in 3D printing and CNC. So we're supporting the ecosystem. I'm hearing, we've been just starting this panel and I've heard the term ecosystem used multiple times and I'm really excited about that. I think that's really where the future is going there. But what we're particularly interested in from an ecosystem and a community perspective as a software company supporting hardware is providing those tools to accelerate development. So just as much as building these boards that help accelerate development and accelerate that prototyping cycle, what happens when you move to that next stage where you've done 5 prototypes and you want to go make 500 or 5,000 or go into production? And as one of the probably least technical people on the panel, I would say that there's from an education perspective, there's this black box of how do you make that transition. And so while it's really easy to be, it's much more accessible to be a maker and to be able to have the tools and learn, what are the tools we can give people to be more supportive as they grow their endeavors?
That's really fascinating, especially, I gotta come back to that with you later on. Anybody else care to chime in? What do you guys do?
With open source hardware, so are you partnering with open source companies or open companies?
Yeah, so we partner with Seed, we partner with Intel, we partner with multiple hardware manufacturers and ODMs and OEMs that are making hardware. For us, our perspective is we actually look to open source, especially the top of the stack that is interfacing with that is interfacing with hardware drivers, and I guess that's the bottom of the stack. But we are aggressively open sourcing as much as we can. That makes sense.
Dale, you're right in the middle of the maker movement. Have you seen anyone actually use Tesla's patents for anything?
Well, I haven't looked to see, but Corky had been given GE patents, some license to use them, which was kind of interesting. The interesting thing, if you look at it at a product level, like Arduino trademarks its name, and that's its main protection for its business, not the hardware, the code underneath that. It hasn't been without problems. I kind of like to look. I mean, we could all be. Let's just applaud open source. I think open source is really what we mean is sharing is kind of a default of the maker community, and that's a good thing. But it also is a choice. People can choose what to share, how to share, how much to share. And I think that's, if you're a small business coming up, person coming up with an idea or an invention, how do you figure that out? Clearly, if you just give it all away, you don't have much left. And a name is a name. It's not necessarily a really extensible model there. Companies like Microsoft and Intel have a different focus in sort of building ecosystems, which they're a major player in. But how do you create something? And I think you're trying to understand what infrastructure pieces you can leverage without building yourself. If you can leverage an existing programming environment instead of developing one yourself, that's great. You can integrate it. But you do kind of have to identify what you think your own unique product is, and I think that's I think open source can enable more players in the market, but it is still a challenge to figure out what is your thing. And obviously you're trying to contribute some things back and other things, but and it's great for hobbyist communities where they don't necessarily care about what anybody pays for something. It enables that. But you do see this progression, like just with MakerBot and others, where it starts out open and free, and they begin to close something down, and then the community kind of turned on them, and you know. But someone like Ultimaker has kind of kept true to that path. So it's an interesting. I find that kind of interesting, and not necessarily saying that the people that do close things or figure out what their proprietary thing is are doing anything wrong. I think it's important for the maker community that people can make a living at what they're doing. So I'd like to see more of that in that discussion.
So you actually keyed in on something that I actually should have said when I spoke earlier. I was not thinking. With the idea of open source, you have access and you have the ability of the transparency. And when the community asks for open source, sometimes they're asking for access. Like, we want this functionality. Other times, they actually want the transparency on how the functionality works. And I think the big balance, when I was talking about the rings before, when you're talking about the small companies and the larger companies, what it really comes down to is effectively making the decisions and offering transparency in the communication of those decisions on why something is you're giving it as access versus you're giving transparency into how it works. And one of the examples we use is like in Windows, the phone dialer control for the modem. There's no reason that something like that, I don't actually know the status of whether that is or is not open source, but something like that, it doesn't necessarily have to be closed source. That's something where the community looking and having the ability to learn from it, looking at bugs and that kind of, I'm only using this as an example, not a statement of whether that is or not made available as open source, but the ability to have access to that functionality and transparency into it will allow the community to only make it better and also work on top of it in ways that weren't originally designed based on access. So,
one thing that you said reminded me of the Raspberry Pi life cycle so far. We did an interview with Evan Upton, and he mentioned that he wished that they had not revealed everything about it immediately because they thought it was just going to be a small little thing that a few people would be interested in. And it turned out that it blew up, and they wish that they had been able to hold on to some of that in order to sort of help them get funding and things like that. Let's move on to the next one.
There's another issue that we could talk about too is, so open source obviously allows anybody to make something, and so we have clones and other things out there. And to some degree that's fine, but we also see where someone clones an Arduino, calls an Arduino, looks like an Arduino, smells like an Arduino. And where the open source community has, I think, a legitimate gripe is when that person shows up in your community and expects you to solve a problem with a clone board, which is relatively
work like an Arduino.
Right. It doesn't have the same quality. Which maybe for a board, an Arduino, you're only paying this much for. But if you kind of think about the world around us and wanting things to work reliably, it is part of a product's statement that we stand behind it. It is our name and our product, and what you got came from us. And I think that's another way of looking at things, that it should operate this way, and when it doesn't, and it fails, like in some kind of mission critical situation, and you're going to go back and blame someone who actually didn't make it for you.
I'd love to continue this. It actually ties into a question 2 from now, so I'm going to skip to that one.
What I was going to say, Dale, to that is, it's not just how it works or the access to it, but also from the support perspective. Like, there's an implication that if something gets created and put out in the wild from a company, that there's a support life cycle and expectation. And the difference between a hobbyist and a corporation and a professional entity looking at something that's being supplied is that support life cycle. For hobbyists, they might want to just tinker with it themselves. For a professional entity, there's actually 3 years, 5 years, 7 years of support that needs to be maintained.
Yeah, and companies like Red Hat have kind of made their market on saying we'll stand behind this open source product.